Chapter 4 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The First Bride of Green Gables. Anne wakened on the morning of her wedding day to find the sunshine winking in at the window of the little porch gable and a September breeze frolicking with her curtains. "I'm so glad the sun will shine on me," she thought happily. She recalled the first morning she had wakened in that little porch room, when the sunshine had crept in on her through the blossom drift of the old Snow Queen. That had not been a happy wakening, for it brought with it the bitter disappointment of the preceding night. But since then the little room had been endeared and consecrated by years of happy childhood dreams and maiden visions. To it she had come back joyfully after all her absences. At its window she had knelt through that night of bitter agony when she believed Gilbert dying, and by it she had sat in speechless happiness the night of her betrothal. Many vigils of joy and some of sorrow had been kept there, and today she must leave it forever. Henceforth it would be hers no more. 15-year-old Dora was to inherit it when she had gone. Nor did Anne wish it otherwise. The little room was sacred to youth and girlhood, to the past that was to close today before the chapter of wifehood opened. Green Gables was a busy and joyous house that forenoon. Diana arrived early, with little Fred and small Anne Cordelia to lend a hand. Davy and Dora, the Green Gables twins, whisked the babies off to the garden. "Don't let small Anne Cordelia spoil her clothes," warned Diana anxiously. "You needn't be afraid to trust her with Dora," said Marilla. "That child is more sensible and careful than most of the mothers I've known. She's really a wonder in some ways. Not much like that other harum-scarum I brought up." Marilla smiled across her chicken salad at Anne. It might even be suspected that she liked the harum-scarum best after all. "Those twins are real nice children," said Mrs. Rachel when she was sure they were out of earshot. "Dora is so womanly and helpful, and Davy is developing into a very smart boy. He isn't the holy terror for mischief he used to be." "I never was so distracted in my life as I was the first 6 months he was here," acknowledged Marilla. "After that I suppose I got used to him. He's taken a great notion to farming lately, and he wants me to let him try running the farm next year. I may, for Mr. Barry doesn't think he'll want to rent it much longer, and some new arrangement will have to be made." "Well, you certainly have a lovely day for your wedding, Anne," said Diana, as she slipped a voluminous apron over her silken array. "You couldn't have had a finer one if you'd ordered it from Eaton's." "Indeed, there's too much money going out of this island to that same Eaton's," said Mrs. Lynde indignantly. She had strong views on the subject of octopus-like department stores, and never lost an opportunity of airing them. "And as for those catalogues of theirs, they're the Avonlea girls' Bible now, that's what. They pore over them on Sundays instead of studying the Holy Scriptures." "Well, they're splendid to amuse children with," said Diana. "Fred and small Anne look at the pictures by the hour." "I amused 10 children without the aid of Eaton's catalogue," said Mrs. Rachel severely. "Come, you two, don't quarrel over Eaton's catalogue," said Anne gaily. "This is my day of days, you know. I'm so happy I want everyone else to be happy, too." "I'm sure I hope your happiness will last, child," sighed Mrs. Rachel. She did hope it truly, and believed it, but she was afraid it was in the nature of a challenge to Providence to flaunt your happiness too openly. Anne, for her own good, must be toned down a trifle. But it was a happy and beautiful bride who came down the old homespun carpeted stairs that September noon, the first bride of Green Gables, slender and shining-eyed in the midst of her maiden veil, with her arms full of roses. Gilbert, waiting for her in the hall below, looked up at her with adoring eyes. She was his at last, this evasive, long-sought Anne, won after years of patient waiting. It was to him she was coming in the sweet surrender of the bride. Was he worthy of her? Could he make her as happy as he hoped? If he failed her, if he could not measure up to her standard of manhood— Then, as she held out her hand, their eyes met, and all doubt was swept away in a glad certainty. They belonged to each other, and no matter what life might hold for them, it could never alter that. Their happiness was in each other's keeping, and both were unafraid. They were married in the sunshine of the old orchard, circled by the loving and kindly faces of long familiar friends. Mr. Allan married them, and the Reverend Jo made what Mrs. Rachel Lynde afterwards pronounced to be the most beautiful wedding prayer she had ever heard. Birds do not often sing in September, but one sang sweetly from some hidden bough while Gilbert and Anne repeated their deathless vows. Anne heard it and thrilled to it. Gilbert heard it and wondered only that all the birds in the world had not burst into jubilant song. Paul heard it and later wrote a lyric about it, which was one of the most admired in his first volume of verse. Charlotta the Fourth heard it and was blissfully sure it meant good luck for her adored Miss Shirley. The bird sang until the ceremony was ended, and then it wound up with one mad little, glad little trill. Never had the old gray-green house among its enfolding orchards known a blither, merrier afternoon. All the old jests and quips that must have done duty at weddings since Eden were served up, and seemed as new and brilliant and mirth-provoking as if they had never been uttered before. Laughter and joy had their way, and when Anne and Gilbert left to catch the Carmody train, with Paul as driver, the twins were ready with rice and old shoes, in the throwing of which Charlotta the Fourth and Mr. Harrison bore a valiant part. Marilla stood at the gate and watched the carriage out of sight down the long lane with its banks of goldenrod. Anne turned at its end to wave her last good-bye. She was gone. Green Gables was her home no more. Marilla's face looked very gray and old as she turned to the house which Anne had filled for 14 years, and even in her absence, with light and life. But Diana and her small fry, the Echo Lodge people, and the Allans had stayed to help the two old ladies over the loneliness of the first evening, and they contrived to have a quietly pleasant little supper time, sitting long around the table and chatting over all the details of the day. While they were sitting there, Anne and Gilbert were alighting from the train at Glen St. Mary. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Anne's House of Dreams by Chapter 6 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Captain Jim. Old Dr. Dave and Mrs. Dr. Dave had come down to the little house to greet the bride and groom. Dr. Dave was a big, jolly, white-whiskered old fellow, and Mrs. Doctor was a trim, rosy-cheeked, silver-haired little lady who took Anne at once to her heart, literally and figuratively. "I'm so glad to see you, dear. You must be real tired. We've got a bite of supper ready, and Captain Jim brought up some trout for you. Captain Jim, where are you? Oh, he slipped out to see to the horse, I suppose. Come upstairs and take your things off." Anne looked about her with bright, appreciative eyes as she followed Mrs. Dr. Dave upstairs. She liked the appearance of her new home very much. It seemed to have the atmosphere of Green Gables and the flavor of her old traditions. "I think I would have found Miss Elizabeth Russell a kindred spirit," she murmured when she was alone in her room. There were 2 windows in it. The dormer one looked out on the lower harbor and the sandbar and the Four Winds Light. "A magic casement opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn," quoted Anne softly. The gable window gave a view of a little harvest-hued valley through which a brook ran. Half a mile up the brook was the only house in sight, an old, rambling, gray one surrounded by huge willows through which its windows peered like shy, seeking eyes into the dusk. Anne wondered who lived there. They would be her nearest neighbors, and she hoped they would be nice. She suddenly found herself thinking of the beautiful girl with the white geese. "Gilbert thought she didn't belong here," mused Anne, "but I feel sure she does. There was something about her that made her part of the sea and the sky and the harbor. Four Winds is in her blood." When Anne went downstairs, Gilbert was standing before the fireplace talking to a stranger. Both turned as Anne entered. "Anne, this is Captain Boyd. Captain Boyd, my wife." It was the first time Gilbert had said "my wife" to anybody but Anne, and he narrowly escaped bursting with the pride of it. The old captain held out a sinewy hand to Anne. They smiled at each other and were friends from that moment. Kindred spirit flashed recognition to kindred spirit. "I'm downright pleased to meet you, Mistress Blythe, and I hope you'll be as happy as the first bride was who came here. I can't wish you no better than that. But your husband doesn't introduce me just exactly right. Captain Jim is my week-a-day name, and you might as well begin as you're certain to end up, calling me that. You certainly are a nice little bride, Mistress Blythe. Looking at you sort of makes me feel that I've just been married myself." Amid the laughter that followed, Mrs. Dr. Dave urged Captain Jim to stay and have supper with them. "Thank you kindly. 'Twill be a real treat, Mistress Doctor. I mostly has to eat my meals alone, with the reflection of my ugly old phiz in a looking-glass opposite for company. 'Tisn't often I have a chance to sit down with two such sweet, purty ladies." Captain Jim's compliments may look very bald on paper, but he paid them with such a gracious, gentle deference of tone and look that the woman upon whom they were bestowed felt that she was being offered a queen's tribute in a kingly fashion. Captain Jim was a high-souled, simple-minded old man, with eternal youth in his eyes and heart. He had a tall, rather ungainly figure, somewhat stooped, yet suggestive of great strength and endurance. A clean-shaven face, deeply lined and bronzed, a thick mane of iron-gray hair falling quite to his shoulders, and a pair of remarkably blue, deep-set eyes, which sometimes twinkled and sometimes dreamed, and sometimes looked out seaward with a wistful quest in them, as of one seeking something precious and lost. Anne was to learn one day what it was for which Captain Jim looked. It could not be denied that Captain Jim was a homely man. His spare jaws, rugged mouth, and square brow were not fashioned on the lines of beauty, and he had passed through many hardships and sorrows which had marked his body as well as his soul. But though at first sight Anne thought him plain, she never thought anything more about it. The spirit shining through that rugged tenement beautified it so wholly. They gathered around the supper table. The hearth fire banished the chill of the September evening, but the window of the dining room was open, and sea breezes entered at their own sweet will. The view was magnificent, taking in the harbor and the sweep of low, purple hills beyond. The table was heaped with Mrs. Doctor's delicacies, but the pièce de résistance was undoubtedly the big platter of sea trout. "Thought they'd be sorter tasty after traveling," said Captain Jim. "They're fresh as trout can be, Mistress Blythe. 2 hours ago they were swimming in the Glen Pond." "Who is attending to the light tonight, Captain Jim?" asked Dr. Dave. "Nephew Alec. He understands it as well as I do. Well, now, I'm real glad you asked me to stay to supper. I'm proper hungry. Didn't have much of a dinner today." "I believe you half starve yourself most of the time down at that light," said Mrs. Dr. Dave severely. "You won't take the trouble to get up a decent meal." "Oh, I do, Mistress Doctor, I do," protested Captain Jim. "Why, I live like a king generally. Last night I was up to the Glen and took home 2 pounds of steak. I meant to have a spanking good dinner today." "And what happened to the steak?" asked Mrs. Dr. Dave. "Did you lose it on the way home?" "No." Captain Jim looked sheepish. "Just at bedtime a poor, ornery sort of dog came along and asked for a night's lodging. Guess he belonged to some of the fishermen 'longshore. I couldn't turn the poor cur out. He had a sore foot. So I shut him in the porch with an old bag to lie on and went to bed. But somehow I couldn't sleep. Come to think it over, I sort of remembered that the dog looked hungry." "And you got up and gave him that steak, all that steak," said Mrs. Dr. Dave with a kind of triumphant reproof. "Well, there wasn't anything else to give him," said Captain Jim deprecatingly. "Nothing a dog'd care for, that is. I reckon he was hungry, for he made about 2 bites of it. I had a fine sleep the rest of the night, but my dinner had to be sort of scanty, potatoes and point, as you might say. The dog, he lit out for home this morning. I reckon he weren't a vegetarian." "The idea of starving yourself for a worthless dog," sniffed Mrs. Doctor. "You don't know but he may be worth a lot to somebody," protested Captain Jim. "He didn't look of much account, but you can't go by looks in judging a dog. Like myself, he might be a real beauty inside. The first mate didn't approve of him, I'll allow. His language was right down forcible. But the first mate is prejudiced. No use in taking a cat's opinion of a dog. 'Tany rate, I lost my dinner, so this nice spread in this delightful company is real pleasant. It's a great thing to have good neighbors." "Who lives in the house among the willows up the brook?" asked Anne. "Mrs. Dick Moore," said Captain Jim. "And her husband," he added, as if by way of an afterthought. Anne smiled and deduced a mental picture of Mrs. Dick Moore from Captain Jim's way of putting it, evidently a second Mrs. Rachel Lynde. "You haven't many neighbors, Mistress Blythe," Captain Jim went on. "This side of the harbor is mighty thinly settled. Most of the land belongs to Mr. Howard up yander past the glen, and he rents it out for pasture. The other side of the harbor now is thick with folks, 'specially McAllisters. There's a whole colony of McAllisters. You can't throw a stone but you hit one. I was talking to old Leon Blackyear the other day. He's been working on the harbor all summer. 'They're nearly all McAllisters over there,' he told me. 'There's Neil McAllister, and Sandy McAllister, and William McAllister, and Alec McAllister, and Angus McAllister, and I believe there's the Devil McAllister.'" "There are nearly as many Elliots and Crawfords," said Dr. Dave after the laughter had subsided. "You know, Gilbert, we folk on this side of Four Winds have an old saying: 'From the conceit of the Elliots, the pride of the McAllisters, and the vainglory of the Crawfords, good Lord deliver us.'" "There's plenty of fine people among them, though," said Captain Jim. "I sailed with William Crawford for many a year, and for courage and endurance and truth that man hadn't an equal. They've got brains over on that side of Four Winds. Maybe that's why this side is sorter inclined to pick on 'em. Strange, ain't it, how folks seem to resent anyone being born a mite cleverer than they be?" Dr. Dave, who had a 40 years' feud with the over harbor people, laughed and subsided. "Who lives in that brilliant emerald house about half a mile up the road?" asked Gilbert. Captain Jim smiled delightedly. "Miss Cornelia Bryant. She'll likely be over to see you soon, seeing you're Presbyterians. If you were Methodists she wouldn't come at all. Cornelia has a holy horror of Methodists." "She's quite a character," chuckled Dr. Dave. "A most inveterate man-hater." "Sour grapes?" queried Gilbert, laughing. "No, 'tisn't sour grapes," answered Captain Jim seriously. "Cornelia could have had her pick when she was young. Even yet she's only to say the word to see the old widowers jump. She just seems to have been born with a chronic spite agin men and Methodists. She's got the bitterest tongue and the kindest heart in Four Winds. Wherever there's any trouble, that woman is there, doing everything to help in the tenderest way. She never says a harsh word about another woman, and if she likes to cart us poor scallywags of men down, I reckon our tough old hides can stand it." "She always speaks well of you, Captain Jim," said Mrs. Doctor. "Yes, I'm afraid so. I don't half like it. It makes me feel as if there must be something sort of unnatural about me." End of chapter 6.